Hey, welcome to another episode of Hanging Out with Nolan Hogg. And joining us this week on the podcast is the Executive Director of the Hawaiʻi Health and Harm Reduction Center here in Hawaii. I had the pleasure of interviewing her last year for a feature for one of our projects that we're doing. And in talking to her, I really got to learn a lot about her personal life and her background, which is so incredible. So aside from the amazing work that she is doing for our community with HHRC, is that correct? Hawaii Health Harm and Reduction Center. I thought it'd be also really great to hear her story because it's really inspiring and really touching. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please help me welcome Miss Heather Lusk. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Aloha, Nolan. Thank you so much.
So, Heather, I mentioned that, the amazing work that your organization does, and we want to get to that too. But I wanted to start a little bit about your personal background first. And so where were you originally born and raised, and what was, I guess, your younger life like? Because I think that's a really fascinating start to today's stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for having me today, and happy Aloha Friday.
Same to you.
So I actually grew up in Michigan, which is, we can often talk about it like this because it is a hand. So I grew up in Ann Arbor, which is about right here, about an hour outside Detroit or so. And had the blessings of being surrounded by water. So maybe, it wasn't an island. It's probably as close as you can get to that. So really appreciated growing up in Michigan, went to college at Michigan State University as well. And then literally, I think the day after graduation, headed out and moved to California, the San Francisco Bay Area. But yeah, really, I've met, there's actually quite a few Michiganders, as they call us here in Hawaii, and even quite a few Spartans. Michigan State is a, mascot or whatever. And it's really neat. And many of us, why we enjoy the fall and winters, are really grateful not to have. It was very, snowy. And I think part of my enjoyment of the islands is not having to winter and have all that time inside that we're, but I feel really blessed to have grown up in a kind of a, nature wonderland too. Lots of natural wonders, lots of opportunities to be in the water. Felt pretty lucky to grow up in a Midwestern, relatively small town.
So why did you choose to head out? Because it seems like you spent your whole life in Michigan up until you moved to California. What prompted you to move to California, which in concept is kind of like clear across the country, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So, one thing too, I really love driving across the country. So I've done that probably at least 6 times, the U.S. continent. So I had already been out to the Bay Area and just really liked it. But honestly, it was a job. So I worked for a bookstore at my university called Ned's. And actually there was a Ned. And so when I helped start the bookstore at Michigan State, meaning it was just opened, and they were opening a bookstore at UC Berkeley in California. And the timing, literally they opened, I think like 2 months after I graduated. And so they offered me a job. Saying, hey, do you want to move to California and start this new bookstore? So I felt like I had a real great opportunity to not only go and start an adventure, but start it with, job. And ironically, it was also a job that brought me to Hawaii. So those are the only 3 places I've ever lived, was Michigan, California, San Francisco area, and Hawaii. And it was a job that brought me to Hawaii as well, about 10 years after I moved to San Francisco.
Holy smokes. So was the job that was offered to you in Hawaii related to bookstore as well, or? Oh,
not at all. Yeah, no. Okay. So I think part of my story of where kind of my personal met professional was moved to San Francisco, helped start the bookstore, and really enjoyed it. I mean, I was fresh out of college, Nolan, so really just kind of enjoying that freedom. But I saw HIV, meaning I could walk around. This was 1983. I could walk around and see the chaos on people. I could see people wasting. It was before the meds. So I got very motivated to volunteer and started volunteering at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation pretty soon after I moved. And that is where I ended up working after I left the bookstore. It was actually the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. That's where I really, I think in a lot of ways fell in love with the work, which probably sounds ironic, but meaning the work of really seeing the disproportionate harm and the social determinants of health in action in HIV, meaning it wasn't an equal opportunity disease, and that there was a lot of, whether it was homophobia or other isms, and I really started to see my social justice desire come into play with my kind of public health, natural wanting to help the communities be safer and healthier. So at that point, I started volunteering in HIV, then got a job in HIV, and then, here I am almost 30 years later, running the largest HIV organization in the Pacific. So I feel so blessed to have been able to, get into that work as a volunteer and then be able to, in some ways, Nolan, it's ironic because I don't want to work in this, meaning I wish we could work ourselves out of a job, that we could cure HIV, that we could cure, addiction and all these other challenges. But until then, it's a way, at least for me personally, to be able to do as a social worker, social justice work, but also increasing the health and well-being of individuals and communities. So yeah, in some way, it was really full circle that then I ended up coming here to do this work after doing HIV work in California for about a decade.
So where do you think that desire and motivation and passion came from to want to do public service or want to help others? Like, was this something that you've always noticed in yourself, or was this something that an individual experience kind of sparked this, light in you?
Yeah. Wow, you have such great questions. Very insightful. A little bit of both. So I have some significant trauma in my own background and abuse. And I always knew that I wanted to try to help contribute to a world where more children didn't have to experience that. So I think that first looked like, even in high school, I was volunteering I think they were called candy stripers at the time, where you volunteer in a hospital. So I'd volunteer in the hospital and take books or just talk story with some of the people suffering. And I don't remember why that interested me, other than I just knew I wanted to do something more to be supportive. And, I had a connection to the hospital, and next thing you knew, that's how I spent my summers, was being able to do that. And then in college, my first volunteer job as a freshman is I became a suicide prevention counselor on a crisis hotline, where we would, be the ones that people could call 24 hours a day. And so just from I don't know, I always just felt that need to be that kind of person that maybe I didn't have, as far as, somebody who could listen, who could be supportive, who could walk alongside me or witness, what's going on. And then from there, I, ended up being a rape counselor, which was really heavy. And then that's when HIV started really kind of impacting my social circle. I always, identified with the LGBT community and had a lot of friends that got HIV. And that's when it really started to help me understand that it was because of who the community was, that they weren't getting the support they needed or the resources. And it started kind of helping me understand that it was all connected, that the kind of barriers on the front line to getting people services, that actually there was systemic, discrimination or lack of resources that were contributing. And I started a better understanding that if I wanted to kind of alleviate individual level harm or suffering, that I really needed to get involved on a system level. And I think I consider myself today to be what's called a system level social worker, or a macro social worker, of really trying to look at system level ways to alleviate suffering, create health and well-being, and support communities in finding their own answers. So I just feel so lucky that I've been able to find paid work in something that is just so personally fulfilling, and additionally to be professionally fulfilling.
I find it so amazing that people who have similar stories like yourself, that go through traumatic experiences, find that as a motivation to want to do things and be people to others that they wish they had for themselves, because it could go the other way too. I've seen it where people who go through traumatic experiences are like, hey, I had to deal with this, like, so, you can deal with it too. Or they use that as their reasoning for not wanting or not feeling like they can provide or contribute in ways. So for you, did you ever have to kind of struggle with that in your journey of like, because you went through those experiences, it's not as easy as like, oh, I went through it, so now I'm going to help you. I'm sure there's a process in it, right?
Yeah, no, you're so right. I mean, you've heard the term hurt people, and I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't come out anywhere. It's really, unfortunately, a lot of whether it's abuse and trauma, suffering can be generational or can, it rarely comes without the perpetrator having maybe some experience themselves of being a victim. And so that cycle of violence or the cycle of, I think really is true, at least in my experience. So definitely, I think that the one, I've often seen both with myself and others that challenge to not perpetuate some of the things like you just said. For me, anyway, instead of turning it externally, though I did have definitely had some anger issues very early in my adolescence and got in some trouble. I was blessed to get into some, mental health support relatively early, probably because of those behaviors, and luckily got some help to be able to unpack and start to get some trauma-informed responses. So at least for me, Nolan, most of my anger, frustration, violence, if you want to call it, has been self-directed, unfortunately. And I know I'm not alone. Some of us survivors of trauma, really we do the best we can to heal, but we still just have that kind of like that kernel of whether it's unworthiness or not being lovable or not being enough or that something was our fault, whatever that may be. And I think that's a normal developmental process for many children if they don't have that kind of unconditional positive connection and attachment that we now know is necessary for all mammals, not just human beings. So yeah, but at the same time, I have been able to, really get a lot of support. I'm incredibly privileged and blessed to have, I have a loving partner of 26 years who has, really has been through his own pieces. Has been really, I've had work that's been very fulfilling and, family and friends. So I just feel I've had incredible opportunities. Was I a heartbeat away from, for example, I'm in recovery 27 years from injection heroin.
Wow.
Self-medicating some of my challenges. Am I a step away from HIV or hepatitis myself or houselessness or incarceration? Yes. And it really was only by the grace that I didn't fall on that path. And that's also the reason why I'm so committed is it could have been me. I could have got HIV or hepatitis. I could have, lost everything to addiction. I could have struggled, with having my basic needs met. And luckily it never got that bad for me, but it very much could have. So I think that's the other piece is I'm very aware of how incredibly lucky, blessed I am that my challenges haven't resulted in worse harm, suffering, and lifelong pieces that I've been able to, I struggle still with mental health, but I have a good job, I have a home, I have all of my basic needs met, and that's not true for a lot of trauma survivors. So again, just I think that perspective of what I call a strength-based perspective of trying to focus on the benefits and then, just continuing to get support. And I think that's one of my main messages is that I don't know anybody that wouldn't benefit from some kind of mental health support. And I think particularly those of us working in mental health really need to make sure that we're taken care of so that we can continue to do our work, but that we also don't cause any harm, right, because of our own stuff. So I think that's been my biggest challenge, Nolan, is taking care of myself and knowing I have these issues and trying to maybe being hyper aware of how that might impact my relationships, my work, and never wanting other people in my life to have to suffer because I can't manage. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's, I think it's a common struggle for folks that have experienced trauma.
No, I think it makes total sense. And I think this is a perspective that not a lot of us think about for those who recognize that we have mental health struggles. A lot of the times, especially for me, when I was learning about mine in the beginning, it was more of this is a me problem. It affects me. Not realizing how much it affects so many around me, particularly my loved ones. And that is what sparked my, decision to really pursue getting that help. So before, just helping for myself wasn't enough. There's shame and guilt attached to it. And I didn't feel like I deserved it. Like, there's people far worse off than me. So who am I to say I need that? Right. But then when I started to realize just how much me not treating myself and taking care of myself hurt and affected others, that's when I was like, I really need to pursue getting help and fixing this. Was that kind of is that kind of what you meant by
Yes.
what you just said?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And no, yeah, exactly. And I think that at least some of the irony for me too is that I call that comparative suffering, by the way, when any one of us say, oh, my suffering wasn't as bad, or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even worse, oh, my suffering is worse than your suffering. And this
Yeah.
idea that somehow somebody's journey and somebody's trauma is worse than somebody else's, when I think it's all individualized, right? Or community
Mm-hmm.
level. And you just, it's I don't think it does us any good to go down that rabbit hole of trying to compare ourselves, and yet it's a natural thing to do, of like, oh, like you said, like, oh, this isn't as bad, or me, oh, that's not as bad as the folks that are houseless, or that are
Mm-hmm.
really struggling with addiction or whatever. At the same time, it feels like to me that that common connection, it really helped me, meaning realizing how many others struggle with mental
Yeah.
health challenges, how many others have had trauma, how many others have the demons they fight every day to be able to be in the world the person they want to be. Um, I think I mentioned to you when we talked last year that I've been really enjoying this practice called mindful self compassion. That's an evidence based practice of identifying in our own suffering, and being kind to it. And there's the reason I'm bringing this up now is there's three components to it. The first one is the mindfulness or the awareness that we're being hard on ourselves, or that we're suffering, or that we're going through something. The second is the compassion of that, cultivating that kindness towards ourselves. Um, Third, though, is what's called common humanity, of really acknowledging that most of us are the thing that we're suffering from or hurting from. There's somebody else that also has that. In fact, it's very common. And so that idea of, oh, I'm hurting, but boy, it's really common for people to hurt. And okay, it's not just me. This is greater than me. That can really help, at least for me, kind of alleviate it. Like a very quick example is, I'll use something benign. My car just cost me $1,500 to get fixed. So at first I was like, oh, woe is me, I don't have this money. And then I was like, wait, like, I'm so lucky to have a car. Like, I'm really blessed that I have a credit card I could put this on. And oh my gosh, anybody who has a car has to work with these challenges. And if I think I'm going to go through life without having car challenges and yet have the privilege of having a car, then I still gave myself a little bit of like, oh, that sucks. And, but I really, I was able to use that process of, lots of people suffer, have this issue. Actually, I'm really lucky to have a car. At the same time, maybe, giving myself some compassion around, it still really sucks that I had this unexpected expense. So I know that might seem making light of, but I find that process really allows me to both take care of myself, but also almost laugh at how uptight, at least I can get, around these daily things that happen to all of us. Life isn't perfect. Life is full of challenges, and the more that I can try to be grateful, and still acknowledge and feel those pieces, and then, really try to move on to things that I really want to spend more of my mental, spiritual, and emotional energy on. So it's easier said than done, right, Nolan? But I'm just
Mm-hmm.
curious if that resonates for you at all, that idea of, being kind to ourselves, but also acknowledging that many people probably struggle with whatever that is that we're upset about. And then therefore, we're not special. We're just part of the human condition. And all of
Yeah.
us have days where we're not perfect and we make mistakes and we have to do things we might not do. And to think that life is any different is actually, at least in my mind, setting up really unreasonable expectations.
Yeah. So my approach to that has morphed throughout my years. Initially, it was a tool that I used that was shaming myself, where it's like, oh, look, everybody else goes to that. Like, who are you to think like this is a bigger deal for you? Like, you should be ashamed that you even, that this even bothered you. Now I use it from the approach of inspiration, where I go,
Yeah.
there are so many people who've done the same thing, and they're okay. Like, it sucked, but they moved on and they're okay. And like, so I know I think my anxiety comes from not knowing what will happen, like the fear of the future. And so for me, what I base it on is like, well, their futures turned out fine, so I can then think mine will be fine as well. And so it's kind of taken that kind of journey for me. But yeah, I definitely have that running a lot in my head of seeing what else is out there and thinking of others, when I go through something.
Yeah. Well, and don't you feel, Nolan, that I've never seen as much anxiety in our community and in
Yeah.
society as I have seen right now. Whether
Yeah.
it was COVID pieces, just kind of the unpredictability of it seems like every day something else happens, whether it's a climate crisis or war related, or there's just so many things happening that, yeah. So I'm trying to also remember that, I saw a stat saying almost 1 in 4 people right now are struggling with some kind of anxiety. And it's just like, yeah, that it's an anxious time, in
Yeah.
addition to maybe our own personal anxiety.
Yeah, I'm so curious to hear your response to this because I think there is the belief like, oh, it's that our society is more sensitive and weaker to dealing with adversity, and then there's the other side. It's like, no, the reason why there's more anxiety is because the world now is far worse or different or challenging than it was back when there was quote unquote less anxiety. And then there's the other thought of, no, we've all had this anxiety. It's just that only now it's acceptable to talk about it. So I'm curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts on that
That's
is.
really good to think about. I definitely agree with the latter point that there's been more language and acceptability about talking about that it's okay to not be okay. I feel like
Hmm.
that's really been that there's definitely that piece, and I've seen more people, more celebrities come out with their struggles around mental health. Just more normalizing of it. So yeah, definitely though the other 2 points, I'm much more on the camp of not that we've lost our kind of collective resilience, or that we're being reactive or too sensitive. Personally, I don't. That's not my perspective. Though I can see maybe with the kind of inundation of information and just the age of social media, which by the way, I don't do social media for my well-being because at least for me, that would cause a lot of anxiety and unwellness. But for people that really enjoy that, there's just always something that you can be distracted by. There's always something you can have an emotional reaction to. There's always a rabbit hole to go down. And so maybe that's the only kind of way I could see this idea of us being more sensitive or less able to balance. It's just because there's so much more access to things that can be, sometimes I don't like the word trigger, but I mean, that can activate
Yeah.
us. Yeah. But more so, I actually think it's the pace, and that
Um,
accessibility of 10 years ago, something traumatic would happen and it wasn't on every news feed, on every device that we have. I personally really believe in this idea that repetition of traumatic events in media and in pictures and in film perpetuates trauma.
mhm.
I think there's been some studies from 9/11, for example, of people that have watched what happened over and over, had a different reaction than people who maybe didn't do a lot of the media, of the pictures. So I think that has a contribution. That's just everywhere
Yeah.
you look. If you don't protect yourself the way I try to, it's
Hmm.
everywhere. And we know that a lot of the algorithms and ways that people try to tailor content is around, trying to get your attention, which means it might be around suffering or gotcha or look at this or pulling at your emotions because it wants you to pay attention because somewhere there'll be probably an ad or something to make money, right, during that. So
Right. Right.
not to get too philosophical, but I definitely think that just the whole media and social media is trying to get us to have emotional reactions to the content so that we'll keep coming back and that we'll keep looking at the scrolling and what's it called, doom scrolling or whatever. Yeah. So no, I to me it's more of that, and then more
Yeah.
of just these constant unpredicted change. I mean, I don't know about you, Nolan, but I'm a creature of habit. I honor change and promote it systemically, but personally, change is hard, and I
Mm.
think that's true for many people. And so these things moving so quickly, not knowing what's coming next. COVID. Oh, it's going to be 2 weeks. Oh no, wait, maybe a month. Okay, maybe just a
Yeah.
few months. Okay, now we're 2.5 years in. So. It just feels like at any time we might get a feed or something that's happened that we just weren't expecting. So to me, that contributes to it. I also really think that the isolation period really impacted a lot of people. There's been some real research that isolation might be even a higher correlate with early demise than things like obesity or smoking. It seems to be isolation has a lot of impacts on people, not just mental health, but their physical health. So I've definitely, I think you've probably seen some of these. There's been more kind of public, what I call people having a moment, whether it's been on airplanes, which are at the highest rate ever, or in stores. I just saw a sign at a restaurant here in Honolulu that said, please know our staff are working as hard as they can and be kind. And if you need to, raise your voice, just remember they're working as hard as they can. And I was like, oh, our poor service folks have just been getting everybody's frustration of the, the pandemic. So I'm sorry, I'm starting to ramble, but I just think there's so many reasons why people are, at least for me, are feeling more anxious. And I know I am, from all these layers over the past few years.
And before I continue on with this, I just need to explain. My dog Emmett is on my lap snoring, and so if you're hearing strange noises, it's not me, okay. It's the dog. Okay, so listeners, Emmett, don't judge me, because he's making some strange noises, and I'm like, this could be misperceived as a bodily function of mine or something. So
was Emmett the same dog you had on your lap at the HOWNH that I saw?
No, that is Hamby, who is also here, who wants to get on my lap. So if you hear scratching,
so to see if they can both get there.
Yeah, and I think I could make it happen, but I'm not going to try, because they need to take turns. But I also think that and maybe it's a generational thing, or this is an actual thing, but I feel like 20-30 years ago it seemed like things were so more matter of fact. Like, we all had more of a collective understanding of things. Whereas now, more than ever, it's like you can look at it from 40 different angles and everyone can have a totally different view of it. And there's less of a connective, I feel like we all have our own individuals positions, which I think there's really great positives that we're celebrating and embracing our individualism. But then when it goes too far to the extreme, it's like then there's no connection between us, and that also could play a factor. Do you feel like that's kind of what you've seen too?
I think you nailed it.
Okay.
Yeah, we just had a great training here at H3RC called Crucial Conversations. I don't know if you ever heard about that. It's a book, an evidence-based way to have conversations, whether it's in the workplace or personally, that may be hard to have, but that if you don't have them can have a negative impact. And they use this thing called this pool of shared meaning. And that really resonated with me, because I feel like it's part of what you're saying, is that we used to really have agreed upon, whether it was information, pool of shared meaning, we had these agreed, and now whether it's disinformation or false facts or whatever you want to name it, there's just so many different opinions on things that we used to be able to agree upon. So I think that's a real. And then also people, whether it's online or wherever else, people can kind of dig at others, call names, kind of without being anonymous. And so that also, I feel like, kind of makes our social fabric start to disintegrate, because it's this idea that I might even get attacked online from someone who doesn't know me, and maybe I shouldn't care about how they feel. But it's, again, going back to, focusing on what is important, but also that idea that we have this connection, even in those we disagree on, instead of it being divisive, this whole us and them versus us. So I really agree with you. And it's heartbreaking to see, because to me, we're all interconnected. Most of us have lots of more ways that we're similar than we're different. And it doesn't feel that the rest of society right now just feels so divisive. Yeah. I don't know about you, but many of us have lost friends just because of maybe what my beliefs are. And I know I'm not the only one. And that's just it's a different time, where used to be you disagreed, you kind of agree to disagree, you found out where you're common, and that's where you spent your time and your energy. But there's still, I feel like, some hope in that idea of common ground. There's been some I've seen a lot of focus on whether I've heard it called living room conversations, or others, of really trying to encourage more talk story between people that are different. And that's something I really love to do, is I love to be able to work on my own judgments, suspend them, work on my discomfort, so I can really hear from someone who has a very different opinion than mine, to better understand how they got to that space. When's the last time you saw or experienced something like that, Nolan? Maybe you have that on your podcast, of where you can truly connect with somebody that maybe has those really different opinions, and still do it respectfully, do it, with aloha, and both of you leave learning something. I miss those conversations.
Yeah, and I think the difference with making that happen versus what we're seeing a lot of is that when that's done right, it's coming together of a genuine desire to understand and learn each other.
Yeah.
Whereas the other way is I need to invoke,
Prove.
and
Yeah.
push to you
Yep.
and change you, which is really what is the word, like, destructive, like
Yeah.
it's a one-way relationship.
Yep. Going into that with
Yeah.
that agenda of I need to convince you or I need to show you. Yeah, I have that particularly in harm reduction, which is, what is in the name of our agency, but is a philosophy and a way of working with people that tries to what's called meet people where they are. It's one of our most common. And sometimes I and others, like, we're trying to hit people over the head with harm reduction. I said, it's very ironic that we're trying to have people meet them where they are, but we're not meeting people where they are that don't believe in harm reduction. Like, we have to model the same piece with harm reduction of meeting people where they are that don't understand why, we do what we do, because it's very hypocritical and ironic to yell at someone to meet people where they are when we're not meeting that person where they're at. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and speaking of that, it kind of going back to you not only meeting people where they are, but also being vulnerable and opening up about your experiences. And this we talked about when I talked with you last year, which I found really fascinating and also inspiring, is that for a lot of us, we look at people in leadership positions like yourself and just think, oh, you guys are leaders because you got it all together. And that we see, like, on television, the boss is always like so confident and like, this is the way of the land. And when all of us below go like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, but what you have done is really change that narrative, and try to implement in your organization, in your leadership skills of just being vulnerable and opening up about the things that you struggled with and stuff, and not have this image of this Teflon, like, nothing bothers me and I'm strong. You guys, like, none of your problems should matter because I, follow my lead. Can you share a little bit about how that has affected your not only relationships with those who you work with, but even in how they're able to come to do the jobs that they're doing? Because I think for those who aren't familiar with this style, would be shocked by it to hear, like, you're the leader of this organization and you told them that you have mental health issues and you've had this past and stuff. Like, that's insane. Why would you be so vulnerable? So I would love for you to share a little bit about that.
Well, I think one piece is that I'm a real big believer in Brene Brown's work. She's a social worker that, if you've ever heard of her, and her whole research and now kind of and work is around both shame, vulnerability, and she has a whole leadership book and training called Dare to Lead. And her real philosophy, which really resonates with me, is that you can't have courage without vulnerability. And in order to be vulnerable, and by being vulnerable, it allows connection in a way that really fosters and builds the leadership connection with teams, instead of having the opposite effect. So not only have I seen the research that says vulnerability in leaders has been effective, and that there's not only has there been significant research in that, but people really feel connected at times to leaders that are willing to share like that. So that's part of it. But the other piece is that I've just always been somebody who, and probably not always a good thing, but that's just been relatively transparent of the flawed human being that I am, because I, am kind of constantly aware of those flaws and working on them myself. But also that my experience has been that then I can connect with other people who have similar vulnerabilities or similar challenges. So I think that's the big piece. But definitely finding Brene Brown, I think, gave me the permission to do it, Nolan, because I wasn't as vocal prior to kind of jumping into her work, and really seeing the research that supported leaders in being vulnerable were more successful. So I think that was what gave me that lead. And right now, actually, I'm going to be sending some of my staff to a Honolulu version of Dare to Lead, and really excited to see how they feel about this concept of vulnerability being actually a foundation of leadership. But again, not without making, but without making it about ourselves, right? So the other piece of her work is around being value driven and knowing what your values are and being able to communicate that. She often says being clear is kind, being unclear is unkind. So kind of moving away from being nice and being more kind and transparent and honest. So all of those pieces together to me are kind of the part of the integrity I feel like that is my responsibility, not just as a leader, but as a human being. So I don't know if that made sense, but those are kind of some of the ways that I have thought about vulnerability.
Yeah. And what's, for you, what is the difference between being nice and being kind? Because some may say, well, that's the same thing, right? But it's not.
Right. No, it's not. To me, nice is that kind of socially acceptable. I feel like so nice would be something like somebody asking me, how does this outfit look on me? Oh, it looks really great. You look fabulous. Versus, I'm glad you asked me, and you can take this or leave it, but it feels like it's actually aging you a little bit. I don't know if I would say that, Nolan, but or it feels like that you may be giving the impression of this. So it's me being more honest about my true, but without being like, oh, that looks crappy on you, or something like that. So being real kind in the feedback and honest versus sharing what you think they want to hear or what you think you need to say because you're worried about maybe hurting their feelings, when really most people want each other to be honest, but you just want to be kind in that honesty, without being. So that was probably not the best example, but that's, I think, how I see the difference between being nice. And I was a very nice person, and I'm trying to turn into a kind person where I'm honest, but kind in that honesty.
And I think what I hear when you use that example, which by the way, I'm never going to ask you how this looks on me. No, I'm just kidding. But the kindness is that whatever feedback you're giving, it's honest, but it comes from a place of you wanting to help and wanting,
exactly,
because they're asking you because they need help. And there's a difference between saying something to be mean and saying, hey, I'm just being honest, but your intention is to bring them down or hurt their feelings or humble them, whatever. That's not kindness. But when you're being honest, but it's from a place of wanting to help, then that's kindness, right?
Right. And there's also not being kind if they really want you to be honest and then you're not. I don't think that's kind either, right? Because they're wanting honest feedback. And if you're just placating them or saying that, then that's, ironically, the reason I use that example is I actually had a really powerful conversation with someone this a long time ago where I was not honest about something that she was wearing. And she actually had worn it as a joke to like get me to have a response, and I didn't. And it really, she was like, well, why weren't you honest with me? Like, this was my old dress I had to wear to my bat mitzvah or something, and I would never wear that now. And anyway, it was just a really interesting conversation that allowed me, like, why did I feel like I had to say it was okay when really in my inside voice it wasn't okay? So anyway, but I like that idea of really holding, for myself anyway, myself accountable to that integrity of being honest, but always making sure that it comes from, a place of that compassion and empathy.
Yeah, I know where you got a busy schedule, so I want to honor your time, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to open up a little bit about this, because in you're talking about being transparent and also coming to a place where people can understand better by trying to meet them where they are. You had mentioned earlier that, you had your battles with addiction. And I find that it's interesting, like when we hear of the stories when someone beats addiction and has success like yourself, we celebrate them and say how great, and inspirational they are. And they are. But when they are going through the addiction, the general response is not met with empathy. It's met with judgment. And a lot of it is like, look at this. They're just a druggie, like these people are selfish, So you had the experience of going through this whole process, and I wanted to get your perspective so that maybe those who do have that kind of judgment can better understand those who go through addiction. And I know everyone has their own stories, but maybe hearing yours might help them feel a little more empathy, but also understand how they could maybe help versus, I'm sure, judging someone it doesn't help at all. So
No,
yeah.
not at all. In fact, you talked about shame. There's a lot of research about shame that people who struggle with substances have, especially as they may lose, people in their life or lose their jobs or have, consequences. And that drugs are a really great way to medicate shame, and the kind of cycle that happens of both external discrimination and internalized shame that makes it really challenging to then actually be able to make changes, because then my experience has been when I'm working with people, and especially in early recovery, all that shame comes up, all that worry, all of those relationships that got hurt, all the self-harm, taking responsibility. Even if people aren't doing kind of the formal 12 steps that have some of those practices, it can be really overwhelming for people to start taking accountability for maybe the things that happened when they were down the path of using chaotically, I often call it, substances. So no, and it's actually, to be honest, it's one of the main reasons I do what I do at the Hawaiʻi Health and Harm Reduction Center. Is I've met so many amazing people that are in chaotic substance use, and a lot of other people see is a substance use. They see them as that addict. They use words like dirty, you're dirty, or you're in a dirty UA, or you're dirty, you're in drug screen. And one thing I say is, you never have a dirty pregnancy test. Well, then no, you have a positive urine drug screen, and you don't have a dirty. So there's all these language ways that that I think continuously shame and blame people who struggle with substances. And if you just stopped using, then your life would be better. And I feel like that doesn't take into consideration all of if people, again, are self-medicating trauma or mental health issues that they don't have the skills to do. There's a lot of generational substance use where the first time they did it was with a parent. That's my husband's story. Cocaine, I think he was 8, and cocaine was given to him. So there's and that's not a rare story where people, that's where they're exposed, is it's at the home, and that the only way you bond with your parent is through substances. So there's all these kind of layers about why people ended up where they ended up. And I wish it was as easy as just saying, oh, I'll just say no to using this substance.
Right.
And so I think that the more people can understand that for many people, they didn't wake up saying, you know what, I didn't wake up or was saying, I want to put a needle in my arm, and I want to inject heroin, and I want all of the harms that come with that. But I know that's easier said than done. There's a really powerful group of public service announcements out of, I can't remember the state, but what they're doing is they take somebody with cancer, and they have the person have cancer, but then the parents speak to him like he was having a struggle with drug use. Like, how could you? Why don't you you are just so weak. You're just, and when it's cancer, you're like, whoa, you would never do that.
Yeah.
Well, many of us believe that substance use is a interconnected disease similar to, that has some of the same components of a disease like diabetes or cancer. They have someone else with Parkinson's, again, blaming, why are you falling down? And so that kind of blaming is so stark when it's not substance use. And yet so it's the last thing I want to say is there's a really powerful research called Rat Park. You probably heard, Nolan, growing up, that, cocaine is or whatever drug is so addictive that you put water in a cage with rats and you put cocaine, that they will do all the cocaine until they die of dehydration. Did you ever hear of that? Yeah.
No.
So, okay. Well, that's a common, and there was studies. Then there was a study called Rat Park, where what they did is they put in rats with other rats, and they made rat, wheels, and they made really interesting things for the rats to do. And long story short, they put cocaine in that and water, and the rats didn't take the cocaine. And that research, along with others, shows that connection, things to do, feeling like that you have meaning in your life, that is actually one of the most powerful treatment for substance use and helping people. And in fact, I really like this quote by Gabor Mate, that connection is the antidote to addiction. Because my experience has been that when somebody has that person that believes in them, that can uplift them, that can support them, it's a lot easier to manage and try to change their relationship with substance use than for those that feel completely alone, feel rejected, feel like society doesn't care, maybe their family doesn't care. So there's something there around, you give connection, you give things meaning, you give people things to do and ways to connect in their community. And then you have a very different relationship with substances than you would when you're in a cage with nothing but the drug. Anyway,
that makes sense.
so I think the more that we can help people see the complexity of this, but also that, again, that the last thing people need that are struggling with substance use is more alienation, more isolation, more shaming, that actually perpetuates the problem. Instead of bringing people close, saying we care about you, we want to help you, we want to support you. That's really the philosophy of our agency, and why we have the no wrong door approach, where just keep coming as you are. And as long as you're, respectful, no violence, no disrespect, you're welcome. And when you're ready, we'll be here to talk to you about that next step. And if you're not ready, you're still welcome. And I really have seen amazing success with just being there alongside, being that support, being that witness. And then when somebody's ready, willing, or able, they know who they can go to get maybe that lift up.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I apologize. I kept you longer than I promised I would. So
no, that was on me. I'm sorry. I can get going. So forgive me. You've asked such good questions. I just makes me want to talk.
I wish we could talk even longer, because we didn't even really get into, Hawaiʻi Health Harm and Reduction Center. So what I would love to ask is that we can do a part 2 with you. I know your busy schedule, but maybe in the future that we can jump back on. And I think the work that you're doing with your organization and for our community is so incredible. And I want to give space to spreading more about that. But really quickly, so I can let you go, for those who are interested in learning more about your organization or how they can help, what can they do to learn more, or how can they help?
So we encourage folks to go to www.hhhrc.org. And we have a newsletter, a monthly newsletter you can sign up for, that gives you updates on what we're doing. We have some open jobs, so always looking for that next harm reductionist that wants to come work for us. We also have volunteers and opportunities. We'd love interns. So there's lots of ways to plug in from the website. And you can also learn more about the trainings and community events we do. So again, hhhrc.org.
All right, and we'll put the link to that in our show notes and description as well. But Heather, this is, every time I've had a chance to talk to you, I just leave wanting to talk more, and this is no different. So thank you so much for spending the time hanging out with us, and I really do look forward to the opportunity and chance to having another conversation with you and continuing this really valuable conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, Nolan.